Have you ever wondered how a single moment of courage could change an entire life? In a quiet mountain town, a police officer carried a secret that kept his daughter hidden away in silence for years, until a new face in their home uncovered something no one dared to believe. What follows is a journey from darkness into light, from whispers of despair into laughter that healed a family. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and share your city. I'd love to know. And if you believe in stories of hope, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss one. Wishing you a truly blessed and beautiful day. The town of Cedar Falls, nestled against the foothills of the Colorado Rockies, lay hushed beneath a winter that refused to end. Snow packed the streets into narrow white corridors, roofs sagged under frosted weight, and the air carried a sharp sting that reddened the skin of anyone foolish enough to step outside without layers of wool and leather. At the edge of town, past a grove of half-dead pines, stood a house that seemed almost swallowed by silence, a large Victorian frame painted in pale gray, its shutters closed more often than open, its windows glowing faintly only in the evenings. It was here that Officer David Monroe lived, a man both respected and pitied by the town's residents. David was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, standing a steady 6'2", his frame once sculpted by years of police patrols, but now carrying a heaviness not entirely from time. His hair, dark brown streaked with gray at the temples, was always combed neatly back, but his eyes betrayed what grooming could not conceal. Hazel in color, they had dulled into a kind of permanent weariness, as though each sunrise weighed on him a little more. His square jaw bore the trace of stubble that he sometimes forgot to shave, and his hands, large and steady, often trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. David had been a devoted husband once, but 5 winters ago, a car crash on a mountain road had taken the life of his wife, Margaret, just 3 days after she had given birth to their daughter. Since then, grief had clung to him like a second uniform. Duty kept him alive, but love for his daughter, frail and withdrawn, kept him bound to this house. That daughter, Lila Monroe, was 8 years old now. Small for her age, with delicate limbs and a face too pale for comfort, she moved through the house like a ghost. Her hair was chestnut brown, long and often tangled, spilling over her thin shoulders. Her storm gray eyes, striking at first glance, had been pronounced blind from birth. They never focused on anything in the room, never lit with recognition or delight, but seemed to stare at some unreachable horizon beyond the walls. Lila rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were quiet, halting, as though each one cost her strength. Most of her time she spent seated near the tall window of the living room, clutching a worn teddy bear and listening to the sound of wind pushing against the glass. Though she did not smile often, there were moments when her lips moved almost imperceptibly, humming to herself in tones too faint for anyone but the closest listener to hear. To David, these small flickers were both a source of hope and pain, proof that something inside her stirred yet remained locked away. Guarding the house, or perhaps simply enduring its quiet as faithfully as his master did, was Ranger, a German shepherd of 6 years. His coat was black and silver, thick against the Colorado winters, his frame powerful but lean from long walks with David. His amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with the kind of loyalty that did not need words. A faint scar along his left flank bore witness to a fight with a mountain coyote years earlier, a wound he had survived with the same resilience he now gave to his human family. Ranger slept lightly, ears twitching at every noise, and often positioned himself between Lila and the door as though she were a treasure no one should dare approach uninvited. To outsiders, he could appear intimidating, his bark deep, his stance firm. But those who knew him saw a creature of deep protectiveness, especially toward the girl who sat so quietly by the window. Life inside the Monroe house followed a rhythm that seemed carved from stone. David rose before dawn, the creak of floorboards and the soft huff of Ranger's breath his first companions. He would brew coffee strong enough to mask his fatigue, then climb the staircase to wake Lila, guiding her gently through the motions of dressing and breakfast. Mornings were slow. He coaxed her to eat, sometimes spoon by spoon, telling her stories of his patrols, of the town, of things she could not see. She seldom responded, but he kept talking because silence was harder to bear. Afterward, he left briefly for his duties at the station in town, but never for long. He avoided overtime, avoided gatherings, avoided anything that might draw him from her side more than necessary. The people of Cedar Falls whispered about David with equal measures of admiration and sadness. They saw him walking down Main Street with Ranger at his heel, his uniform crisp even as his expression remained heavy. Shopkeepers would nod respectfully. Mothers would hush children from asking too many questions. They knew of his tragedy, and though no one spoke of it openly, everyone carried an opinion. Some said he was too protective. Others said he was wasting his life away. None dared tell him, for his presence carried a gravity that discouraged casual words. On this particular February morning, the sky was a bleached gray, clouds sagging with the threat of another snowstorm. David stood at the living room window, watching his daughter seated in her familiar place. She held the teddy bear tightly, her head tilted slightly as though listening to the whisper of pine trees outside. Ranger lay sprawled at her feet, his tail curled around his body, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. David's heart clenched as he watched. He wanted to believe she recognized him, that she felt his presence, but the vacancy in her gaze struck him every time like a blow. "Are you warm enough, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Lila did not answer. She rarely did. But her small hand shifted slightly, pressing into the teddy bear's fur, and for David, that was something, a thread to cling to. He crossed the room, sat in the chair opposite, and began to talk. He told her about the tracks he had seen in the snow that morning, deer prints leading toward the forest, how Ranger had sniffed them and growled softly. He described the sound of the frozen river cracking in the night. He told her about her mother, again, as he always did. Margaret's laugh, the way she used to bake bread that filled the house with warmth. Lila's face remained still, but once, just once, her head tilted, as if some distant chord had been struck. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, and huffed softly. He rose, patted over, and rested his chin on Lila's knee. She let her hand fall absently on his head, her fingers brushing against the rough fur. That small gesture, unremarkable to most, made David's throat tighten. He whispered, almost to himself, "I'll protect you, always." The house creaked with the weight of silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the glass like ash from some unseen fire. David leaned back in his chair, his body weary, but his vow unwavering. The world beyond their gates might judge, might pity, but here, in this cold house at the edge of town, he carried a single promise etched deep into his heart. No matter what, he would guard Lila. And in that vow, Ranger kept silent watch, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, a sentinel beside the girl, who seemed locked in her own unreachable world. The snow had thickened in Cedar Falls overnight, muffling the world in white silence. Main Street lay deserted except for a lone plow moving slowly between shuttered shops, scraping lines of black asphalt through the frozen crust. Inside the Monroe house, the morning was as quiet as ever. The air scented faintly with coffee and wood smoke. David rose early, guiding Lila through the same rituals, Ranger pacing alongside them. Yet the weight of monotony pressed heavily on his shoulders, and when he glanced at the pantry shelves, half empty despite his last trip into town, he realized he could not continue to manage every detail alone. That same week, he placed a discreet notice at the town's community board, seeking housekeeper. Discretion required. It was 3 days later when Clara Hayes arrived at his doorstep. She was 36, tall and slender, with the kind of quiet poise that comes not from arrogance, but from having lived through storms of her own. Her hair was dark auburn, braided neatly down her back. Those stray wisps framed a face more weathered than her years. Her eyes, soft brown with hints of amber, carried an alert stillness, as if they had learned to see what others ignored. She wore a plain wool coat faded at the elbows, boots scuffed but clean, and in her gloved hands she held a small leather satchel. Clara had once worked as a nurse in a rural hospital 2 counties away, but tragedy had followed her, a house fire 5 years earlier that claimed her young daughter's life, and left Clara with scars across her spirit, though not her skin. Since then she had drifted between small towns, working quietly, never lingering long, but always carrying an invisible burden of grief, and a fierce determination not to let sorrow claim anyone else if she could help it. When David first opened the door to her, his guarded expression deepened. Ranger, standing tall at his side, stiffened, his ears pricked and tail rigid. The German shepherd's amber eyes studied Clara with suspicion, his chest rumbling low. But, instead of shrinking back as most did, Clara crouched slightly, extended a steady hand, and spoke softly, "You're a beautiful boy." Her voice held no tremor, only calm steadiness. Ranger's growl eased, though he did not move closer. David, surprised, lifted his brow, but said nothing. The interview, if it could be called that, took place in the front room. The fire in the hearth burned weakly, casting pale shadows on the walls. David asked practical questions. Could she cook, clean, handle laundry, respect privacy? Clara answered simply, directly, without flourish. She admitted she was not a professional maid, but her time as a nurse had given her skill in caring for others, patience under silence, and attention to detail. When David pressed about references, she named a retired pastor from her old town who had known her family, her voice catching only slightly before she steadied again. Her composure struck David as unusual. She did not seek pity, nor did she offer empty cheer. She was matter of fact, grounded, as if life had already stripped her of illusions and left only the strength to keep moving forward. The real test came when Lila entered the room, guided gently by David's hand. The girl clutched her teddy bear, her head tilted slightly toward the sound of voices. Clara rose to her feet, her eyes softening. She did not step forward too quickly, did not reach out uninvited. Instead, she simply knelt down near the hearth, lowering herself to the girl's level without imposing. "Hello, Lila," she said, her tone quiet and respectful. "It's nice to meet you." Ranger watched keenly, his gaze shifting between the woman and the child. Lila said nothing, but for the briefest moment, her lips parted as though a word had hovered there before retreating. Her head turned slightly in Clara's direction. David caught it and frowned, uncertain if it meant anything. Clara, however, noticed with quiet clarity, and a subtle thought lodged itself in her mind. This child was not entirely unreachable. By evening, David decided to give Clara a trial. She moved into the small guest room on the first floor, unpacking her few belongings with quiet efficiency. Ranger stationed himself in the hallway outside her door at first, suspicious. But after several hours, he retreated to his usual post near Lila. Clara began her work with little ceremony, dusting shelves, scrubbing the old copper pots in the kitchen, airing out rooms that had long remained closed. She hummed softly while she worked, not to draw attention, but as a rhythm for herself, low tunes that once had soothed her own daughter to sleep. Days passed, and a subtle shift began to weave itself into the household. Clara was never intrusive. She spoke when spoken to, answered simply, and otherwise carried out tasks in quiet diligence. Yet her presence altered the atmosphere. The house no longer felt entirely swallowed by sorrow. Small domestic sounds returned, the clatter of dishes, the swish of a broom, the faint hum of a tune. David found himself, reluctantly at first, appreciating the difference. Lila, though she did not smile or speak, no longer spent every hour by the window. At times she lingered in the hallway while Clara polished the floors, or she sat quietly near the kitchen doorway, listening, as Clara chopped vegetables for soup. One afternoon, as Clara dusted the shelves in the study, she dropped a cloth. The sound was small, a soft thump on the rug. Yet Lila, seated across the room in her usual stillness, flinched ever so slightly. Clara froze, her eyes narrowing. She apologized gently out of instinct, though she doubted the girl could perceive the apology. But something stirred in her mind. Later that night, as she folded laundry by the fire, she recalled that moment again, the way Lila's head had moved, subtle but real. In the days that followed, Clara began to notice more. When she entered a room, Lila sometimes tilted her head. When a chair scraped lightly against the floor, the girl shifted. And when Ranger barked once at a passing fox outside, Lila pressed her hands tighter to her teddy bear, a clear reaction rather than a random twitch. Clara kept these observations to herself, unwilling to raise false hope, but the pattern was undeniable. The girl responded, not always, not dramatically, but with small, unmistakable gestures. Meanwhile, the townsfolk of Cedar Falls grew curious. They saw the new woman at the Monroe house when she went to fetch groceries, a tall figure with auburn hair tied back and a guarded expression. Some whispered that she carried a shadow about her. Others speculated she might be a relative, though David never confirmed anything. At the grocery, Mrs. Kettering, a stout woman with kind blue eyes who had run the shop for 3 decades, asked politely where Clara came from. Clara answered with brief honesty, "South County. I used to work in medicine." She said no more, and Mrs. Kettering, sensing unspoken boundaries, pressed no further. The town, like Ranger, learned to watch and wait. On a particularly cold morning, David asked Clara in a rare pause at breakfast, "How are you finding things here?" His voice was measured, his eyes cautious. Clara looked at him across the table, at the way fatigue carved shadows beneath his hazel eyes. "It's quiet," she said, "but not empty." She hesitated, then added softly, "Your daughter reminds me of someone I lost. I don't want to replace anyone. I just want to help." David studied her for a long moment before nodding, a small but significant gesture. Trust did not come easily to him, but something in her calm truthfulness pressed past his defenses. And so the rhythm of the Monroe household shifted again. Clara worked, Ranger watched, David lingered a little less in silence, and Lila, though still shrouded in her own quiet world, began to reveal faint responses that no one else had noticed before. Bao Kao Trong Lap Tieng Viet. Trong chapter hai, Toi Fa Trien Han Vat Moi. Clara Hayes Voi Qua Hu Mat Kon Trong Wu Chai, Lam Ro Vai Tro Quan Gia. Cage Chi Tiet Puve Titran, Qua Hang Tap Hoa, Vab Cage Clara, Quan Sat Fan Ung Ho Qua, Lila Juach Tem Moi. Kong Ko Chi Tiet Nau Trung Hoan Tuan Voi chapter Mot, Van Hung Tin Tiet Theo outline, Clara Be Jaun Han Rafan Ung Ho. Juach Gu Nguyen Hung Fa Trien Moame. Kate Luan, Kong Ko Chi Tiet Trung Lap. The days after Clara's arrival slipped by beneath the steady rhythm of winter storms. Cedar Falls, wrapped in white silence, was a town that noticed everything but spoke little. The Monroe house, perched on the edge of the frozen woods, had grown just a shade warmer. It was not because the weather eased, it didn't, but because Clara's presence brought subtle changes. The clatter of dishes in the sink, the faint humming of a hymn from her childhood, the rustle of sheets shaken clean, all stitched life back into the quiet walls. Clara kept herself busy, yet her watchful eyes never stopped observing. Years in the hospital had trained her to see the smallest signs, the twitch of a hand, the tremor of a lip, the faint shift in breathing. Those instincts now turned toward Lila. Again and again she noticed it. Small responses to things the girl wasn't supposed to perceive. A door creaking open made her head tilt. A candle flame fluttering in the draft drew the faintest movement of her eyes. Once, when Clara dropped a spoon on the kitchen tiles, Lila stiffened visibly. It was enough to stir questions that Clara could not silence. Ranger seemed to notice too. The German shepherd, with his thick black and silver coat and watchful amber eyes, had become her unlikely partner in these discoveries. He would track Lila's gaze with surprising precision, often shifting his head the same way she did, as though confirming her subtle responses. Clara began to sense that the dog, loyal and instinctive, knew more than anyone realized. One late afternoon, when snow was falling in the thick sheets against the windows, Clara decided to tidy the upstairs study. It was a room she had rarely entered, lined with bookshelves heavy with dust, a large oak desk at its center. As she polished the desk, her cloth slipped against a drawer handle. Curious, she pulled it open and found a neat row of small glass bottles. Eye drops, their labels faint, the ink smudged with age. She picked one up, frowning. The prescription name printed on the side was unfamiliar to her, long and chemical, nothing like the saline or allergy drops she had used during her years as a nurse. She placed it back carefully, but unease lingered. She had seen David use these bottles, guiding Lila to tilt her head back, squeezing drops into her eyes with the practiced air of routine. Clara had thought little of it before, but now, after noticing the child's flickering responses, the suspicion gnawed at her. What exactly was this medicine supposed to do, and what if it wasn't helping at all? That evening, she carried her uncertainty down to the kitchen, where David was seated at the wooden table, shoulders slumped in fatigue. He had come off a double patrol, his heavy navy coat still dusted with snow. His face looked older than his years, hazel eyes rimmed with red. Clara set down a bowl of stew in front of him and said nothing at first. Only after he had eaten a few mouthfuls did she dare to ask. "These drops you give Lila," she began cautiously, "how long has she been taking them?" David looked up, surprised. "Since birth," he said simply. "Doctors prescribed them when they diagnosed her condition. Said they would keep her eyes from drying, maybe ease discomfort." His voice carried no doubt, only the steady trust of a father who had clung to every professional instruction given to him. Clara hesitated, then pressed. "Have they ever been changed? Renewed by another doctor?" He frowned, defensive now. "I've followed every instruction I was given." "Why do you ask?" Clara shook her head softly, unwilling to risk breaking fragile trust. "Just curiosity. Sometimes prescriptions change over time." That's all. She let the matter drop, though unease grew heavier in her chest. Meanwhile, the town outside continued with its quiet rhythms. One afternoon, Clara walked to the general store for supplies. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, brushing snow from her coat. Behind the counter stood Thomas Kettering, the grocer's son, a man in his late 20s with sandy blonde hair and a cheerful demeanor that sometimes felt too bright against the town's reserve. He greeted her warmly. "Cold one today, ma'am. You'll need extra firewood." His smile was quick, his hand steady as he packed her basket. Though polite, Clara sensed a hint of curiosity in his glances, as though he wondered about the woman who had suddenly appeared at the Monroe house. Outside the store, she met Reverend Samuel Pratt, a short, balding man with gentle eyes and a kindly stoop. He greeted her with the easy warmth of one who had served the town for decades. "Good to see new faces here," he said. His wool scarf was frayed, his gloves patched, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity. Clara nodded politely, but the brief exchange reminded her of her own past, her ties to another pastor in another county who had once stood beside her in grief. The ache of memory pressed against her, but she buried it quickly. Back at the Monroe house, Clara continued her quiet observations. One night, as she folded blankets in the hallway, she paused by Lila's room. The child was sitting upright in bed, her teddy bear clutched against her chest. Clara, standing still in the shadows, watched as the girl's eyes flickered faintly toward the window where the moonlight leaked through a gap in the curtains. The movement was small but unmistakable. Clara's breath caught. She stepped back slowly, not wanting to intrude, but the thought burned inside her. This child could sense light. She tested her suspicion gently over the next few days, though without making it obvious. While sweeping, she allowed sunlight to reflect off a metal tray into the corner of the room. Lila's head shifted faintly toward it. When she lit a candle on the mantel, she caught the girl's gaze flicker in its direction. Each time, Clara noted the reaction silently, her certainty growing. But with certainty came a heavier fear. What if the drops were doing more harm than good? She remembered the strange labels, the bottles too old to be trusted. Her nurse's training whispered warnings to her, urging her not to ignore the signs. Yet, confronting David outright might shatter the fragile bridge of trust they had only begun to build. So, Clara kept her silence for now. But at night, lying awake in her small room, she could not shake the image of Lila turning toward the moonlight. Something was hidden in this house, something buried beneath years of routine and unquestioned faith in medical authority. Clara knew one truth with growing certainty. She would not leave it buried. Snow continued to fall across Cedar Falls, blanketing the streets and fields in relentless silence. The Monroe house, with its tall windows and shuttered rooms, seemed at once protected and imprisoned by the storm. Inside, the rhythm of the household carried on. David patrolled the town, Ranger patrolled the house, and Clara quietly moved between tasks, her eyes always lingering on the child who sat by the window. But Clara's mind was no longer calm. Every day she saw it, Lila turning faintly toward light, flinching at sound, shifting in ways that defied the certainty of a blind diagnosis. And every night, when she lay awake in the guest room, she thought of the bottles hidden in the upstairs study. Her nurse's training would not let her rest. She had seen medications misused before, watched patients suffer under the weight of prescriptions they didn't need. She remembered one in particular, a boy of 7, pale and skeletal, who had been given the wrong dosage for months until a visiting nurse caught it. He had survived, but barely. That memory clung to Clara like smoke. Now, as she watched Lila, she felt the same warning stirring. One afternoon, while David was on patrol and snow battered the windows with icy wind, Clara climbed the staircase to the study again. Ranger padded silently behind her, tail stiff, ears alert. She closed the door softly and crossed to the oak desk. The bottles lay in their row, glass catching what little light filtered through the curtains. She picked one up and turned it in her hand. The label was nearly worn away, but she could still make out the strange chemical names. The liquid inside shimmered faintly when she tilted it. She unstoppered it briefly, sniffed, and recoiled at the bitter medicinal scent. It did not smell like any standard drops she remembered. As she stood there, a sound startled her. Behind her in the doorway stood Mrs. Olson, one of the longtime staff who had worked quietly in the Monroe house for years. Mrs. Olson was in her late 50s, short and round, with a face softened by age but eyes still sharp. Her hair was pinned in a bun streaked with silver, and she wore a simple gray dress with an apron tied firmly around her waist. She had been with the family since before Margaret's death, loyal and discreet. "Those bottles," she said in a low voice, "they've been here as long as I can remember. Mr. Monroe never questions them. He just does what the doctors told him years ago." Clara replaced the stopper quickly. "Do you know who prescribed them?" Mrs. Olson shook her head. "A man from the city. Came once, never returned." After Mrs. Monroe passed, David never sought another opinion. He said he didn't have the heart to risk hope. He blamed himself too much. Her gaze softened, sadness etched in every line of her face. Then, lowering her voice further, she added, "But I have always wondered. The child, she hums at night, you know. Follows? Sounds I don't think she's as blind as they say." Clara's pulse quickened. She thanked Mrs. Olson and promised silence. After the woman left, Clara stood with the bottle in her hand, her decision forming like ice hardening on the river. That evening, while preparing supper, Clara moved carefully. She set the bowls on the table, ladled stew, and kept her manner steady. David entered, weary from patrol, his boots heavy with snow. Lila sat nearby, teddy bear in hand, Ranger stretched protectively at her feet. Clara's mind was burning, but she spoke only of simple things: the weather, the roads, the townsfolk. She did not dare reveal what she planned. Later, when the time came for Lila's evening drops, Clara stepped forward gently. "Let me do it tonight," she said softly. David, surprised, hesitated, then handed her the small bottle. His trust, fragile but real, lay heavy in that gesture. Clara tilted the bottle, let a single drop fall onto the cloth in her pocket rather than into Lila's eyes, then set the bottle aside. David, distracted, did not notice. Lila blinked slowly, her storm-gray eyes fluttering in the dim lamplight. The next morning, Clara repeated the act. Again, no drops reached the girl's eyes, and again in the evening. By the third day, something remarkable began to happen. Lila was seated near the living room window, as always, her teddy bear in her lap. Sunlight pierced through a gap in the curtains, striking the wooden floor. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lila's head turned toward the light. Her eyes flickered, not blank, but searching. Ranger lifted his head too, amber gaze shifting in the same direction, as if urging Clara to see what he saw. Clara's breath caught. She moved closer, kneeling beside the girl. "Lila," she whispered, "what is it?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice soft as snowfall, Lila said a single word: "Bright." The word stunned Clara. It was not loud, not clear, but it was there. A recognition, a name for something the girl was not supposed to perceive. Clara's eyes filled with tears she dared not shed. She glanced toward Ranger, who thumped his tail once against the floor, as though sealing the truth between them. That night, Clara sat alone in her small room, staring at the bottle she had hidden in her satchel. She knew now with certainty. The medicine was the shadow, not the cure, and she had crossed a line she could never retreat from. The storm that had wrapped Cedar Falls in silence began to loosen its grip by early March. Snowbanks remained high along the town's narrow streets, but icicles now dripped steadily under the sun, and children dared to sled again down the slopes behind the church. At the edge of town, the Monroe house still seemed cloaked in its own winter, yet something inside had begun to shift. Clara kept her secret. The drops had not touched Lila's eyes for nearly a week, and each day, the child seemed to stir further awake. On the 6th morning, David was the one to notice. He had just returned from a night patrol, his uniform coat still flecked with frost, his eyes shadowed by fatigue. As he entered the living room, he saw Lila seated in her usual spot by the window. But instead of staring blankly, her storm-gray eyes seemed to follow the beam of sunlight cutting across the floor. David stopped mid-step, his heart jolting. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if exhaustion deceived him. Clara, standing at the doorway with a folded blanket in her arms, saw his hesitation and held her breath. "Lila," David said softly. "What are you looking at?" The girl's lips parted. For a moment, only silence filled the room. Then she raised a small hand, trembling but deliberate, and pointed toward the sunlight. David's breath caught. He dropped his gloves onto the chair, crossing the room quickly. "Sweetheart, you can see this?" His voice cracked under the weight of years of hopelessness. Lila tilted her head, whispering one word barely louder than the rustle of curtains. "Light." David staggered back as though struck. For years he had spoken to her, read to her, begged her for a response, and now this tiny word, pierced through his despair. He dropped to his knees beside her, his large hand trembling as it brushed her shoulder. "My girl," he whispered. "My brave girl." His hazel eyes shone with tears he did not wipe away. Ranger, sensing the gravity, pressed forward, resting his chin on Lila's knee, amber eyes watching both father and daughter with solemn approval. Clara stood silently, her heart pounding. She knew this moment had been inevitable since she first stopped the drops, yet witnessing David's shock filled her with both relief and fear. Relief that he saw proof. Fear that her secret might shatter the fragile trust they had built. Later that afternoon, David could not keep still. He paced the study, his heavy boots echoing against the floorboards. Clara entered quietly, folding her hands before her apron. "She's responding more each day," she said gently. "I've noticed it for some time." David turned sharply. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was not cruel, but heavy with the desperation of a father who had lived too long in the dark. Clara hesitated, then answered with honesty. "Because I needed to be certain, and because I knew you would demand an explanation before you were ready to hear it. But David, she is not blind the way they said. Something else has been happening." David sank heavily into the chair behind the desk, burying his face in his hands. Years of sorrow warred against sudden hope. "I trusted the doctors. Every word, every instruction. If they were wrong..." He broke off, unable to finish. That evening, while supper simmered on the stove, there came a knock at the front door. Clara went to answer and found Sheriff Walter Briggs standing there. Walter was in his 50s, tall and broad with silver hair beneath his hat, his uniform jacket worn but pressed. His face was weathered from decades of Colorado winters, and his eyes, a steady blue, carried the calm authority of a man respected by his community. He had been David's superior once, before grief had driven David to step back from leadership. Walter greeted Clara with a nod, his voice a low rumble. "Is David in?" "Need to speak with him about patrol routes." Clara ushered him inside. Walter greeted Ranger with a pat to the head before stepping into the study. He and David spoke in hushed tones for several minutes, discussing an uptick in burglaries in the county. But when Walter noticed David's distracted state, he frowned. "You all right, son?" David forced a smile. "Just tired." Long week Walter studied him, unconvinced but unwilling to press. He clapped a heavy hand on David's shoulder before leaving, promising to return for coffee on Sunday. Clara, who had overheard fragments, knew David had not mentioned Lila's sudden change. The weight of secrecy grew heavier between them. The next day, Clara tried a simple test. She drew the curtains wide in the morning, letting sunlight flood the living room. Lila, seated on the rug with Ranger curled protectively beside her, lifted her face toward the brightness. For the first time, Clara saw something like wonder flicker across the child's features. She reached her hand forward, grasping at the air as though trying to catch the golden beam. Clara's throat tightened. She guided Lila's hand gently to the window frame, letting her fingers rest against the warm wood. David, watching from across the room, could no longer deny what he saw. His daughter was responding, not vaguely, not randomly, but with awareness. His heart swelled with a mixture of elation and fury. How had everyone been so wrong? And what had those bottles truly been doing all these years? That night, after Lila had been put to bed, David confronted Clara. His voice was strained, but steady. "There's something you know, something you're not saying. If you've seen this for longer than I have, tell me the truth." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I found the bottles in the study. I don't recognize the formula. I don't believe they are harmless. I stopped using them a week ago." David went pale. His broad shoulders slumped as though the weight of her words had broken something inside him. You stopped?" "Yes," Clara said firmly, and that is when she began to change. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the low crackle of the fire. At last, David whispered, "Then maybe I failed her even more than I thought." Clara stepped forward, her voice gentle but resolute. "No, you did what you believed was best. But now we know better, and we cannot turn away from it." Ranger, lying near the hearth, lifted his head, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. He seemed to sense the gravity of their pact. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, the sky clearing to reveal a pale moon over the mountains. Inside, for the first time in years, there was the fragile spark of hope. By the second week of March, the thaw in Cedar Falls had grown more noticeable. Patches of brown earth broke through the snowdrifts, and rivulets of meltwater trickled along the sides of Main Street. Yet, while the town loosened under spring's promise, the Monroe house carried a new tension. Hope had entered, but with it came risk. Lila's eyes now moved more deliberately, following the path of sunlight, the flicker of a flame, even the glint of Ranger's collar. David no longer doubted what he saw, but the weight of what it meant gnawed at him. He could not keep such change hidden forever. On one morning, Clara led Lila outside to the porch, bundled in a wool coat and knitted hat. Ranger bounded into the snow, barking once before rolling onto his back. Lila laughed, a sound so unexpected that Clara froze. It was soft and short, but real. A neighbor across the road heard it too. Mrs. Evelyn Grant, a widow in her early 60s who lived in a small yellow house. She was tall and thin, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, her sharp eyes always scanning the neighborhood as though cataloging each secret. Since her husband's death years earlier, Evelyn had filled her days with observation and gossip, traits that gave her a reputation as both a busybody and a self-appointed guardian of propriety. When she heard Lila laugh, Evelyn nearly dropped her basket of kindling. She had long believed the girl incapable of such sounds. She narrowed her eyes and lingered at the edge of her porch, watching as Clara guided the child's steps toward the railing where the sunlight struck. Ranger nudged Lila's hand gently, encouraging her to lean forward. Evelyn's lips tightened. By evening, word had spread in hushed tones across Main Street. The Monroe girl laughed. At the general store, Thomas Kettering repeated the tale to two other customers. He had seen Clara more than once guiding Lila into the shop for small errands, and now the image of the child laughing felt like a revelation. The customers, one, a heavy-set farmer named Caleb Moore with a weathered face and calloused hands, the other, a seamstress named Hannah Miller, a petite woman with cropped brown hair and a practical air, exchanged glances. "Strange," Caleb muttered. "I thought she couldn't—" He trailed off, unwilling to finish. Hannah, more sympathetic, shrugged. "Maybe she's improving. Children change, even when we least expect it." Still, the whisper continued to echo. Change was happening in the Monroe house. David soon became aware of these murmurs. Sheriff Walter Briggs mentioned them in passing one evening, stopping by with coffee as promised. Sitting heavily at the Monroe table, his silver hair damp from sleet, Walter said, "Folks are talking." Evelyn swears she heard Lila laughing. "You ready for people knocking at your door with questions?" His blue eyes studied David with concern. David shifted uncomfortably. She's changing. I don't know how to explain it yet. Walter leaned back, folding his arms. Then, be careful. Gossip can twist hope into suspicion, and you've got enough shadows in this house already. That night, David shared his worry with Clara. She sat across from him in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The town will notice, he said. I can't keep her hidden. Not now. Clara's gaze was steady. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's time people saw her for who she is, not what they've been told. She hesitated, then added, but if anyone learns about the drops, they may ask questions you're not ready to answer. The truth between them was fragile but undeniable. Ranger, lying at their feet, shifted and huffed as though punctuating her warning. Days later, another test came. Clara had begun simple exercises with Lila, holding up objects in the light. A red ball, a wooden spoon, a square of cloth. Each time, the girl's eyes flickered, her hand reaching slowly, hesitantly, but with growing certainty. One afternoon, David sat with them by the window as Clara repeated the game. Lila's hand brushed the ball, and she smiled faintly. David's throat tightened at the sight. For the first time, he whispered a prayer aloud. Thank you, God. But while joy swelled within their small circle, Evelyn Grant's whispers grew louder. One evening, she stopped Clara on her way back from the store. Evelyn's sharp eyes pinned her like needles. You're spending an awful lot of time with that child, she said, and people are saying she's not the same as before. What have you been doing in that house? Her tone was not malicious but probing, as though she expected scandal behind every curtain. Clara's jaw tightened. I care for her. That's all she moved past, but Evelyn's gaze followed her all the way down the street. Back inside the Monroe home, Clara relayed the encounter. David paced the floor, anger simmering beneath his grief. If they start to question you, they'll question me. And if they find out about the medicine... His words trailed off, heavy with dread. Clara placed a hand on the table, her voice calm. Then we face it. The truth is not something to hide from forever. Ranger rose from his spot by the hearth, padding toward Lila, who was sitting with her teddy bear. The dog lowered his head against her lap, his tail brushing softly against the floor. The girl stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her storm-gray eyes fixed toward the light spilling in from the window. She seemed, for the first time, present. That night, David could not sleep. He stood at Lila's doorway, watching her rest, her face softened in sleep. Clara's words echoed in his mind, mingling with the whispers of the town. Hope had entered his house, but it carried a cost. He did not know yet if he was strong enough to bear it. Spring pressed harder against Cedar Falls. Snow retreated from the rooftops, and the muddy streets filled with the chatter of townsfolk eager for warmth. Yet inside the Monroe house, unease deepened. Clara and David had watched Lila's changes grow undeniable, her eyes following light, her laughter bubbling forth unexpectedly, her hand reaching with confidence toward objects. Hope blossomed in every small gesture, but alongside it came a gnawing need. They had to know what had been done to her all these years. David could no longer ignore the bottles. One night, while Ranger lay stretched before the fire and Lila slept upstairs, he opened the drawer in his study and placed the row of drops on the desk. The glass reflected the lamplight, cold and sinister. Clara joined him, her auburn hair unbound for once, falling loose against her shoulders. Her eyes were steady as she said, "We need answers. We can't go on with just suspicion." David nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know a man in town who might help. He works at the small clinic by the rail yard, retired Army medic. If anyone can identify these formulas, it's him." That man was Dr. Samuel Keene. In his late 50s, Samuel was a tall, spare figure with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that slid constantly down his narrow nose. His hands were long and scarred, evidence of years spent patching wounds in desert field hospitals. He had returned to Cedar Falls a decade earlier after his wife's death, trading war zones for a quiet practice treating coughs and sprains. Yet beneath his soft-spoken manner lay a mind still sharp, unwilling to accept half-truths. When David and Clara arrived at his office the following afternoon, Samuel greeted them with polite surprise. His clinic was small, 2 rooms warmed by a pot-belly stove, shelves lined with jars and bottles labeled in his careful hand. "David Monroe," he said with a faint smile. "Haven't seen you here in years. And this must be your housekeeper." He inclined his head to Clara with respect. David wasted little time. He placed the bottles on the desk. "I need you to look at these. Tell me what they are." Samuel adjusted his glasses and studied the labels. His brows furrowed almost immediately. He lifted one to the light, swirled the liquid, then sniffed it cautiously. "This isn't a standard prescription," he muttered. "The compound? It looks experimental. Who gave this to you?" David's chest tightened. "A specialist from Denver, years ago, right after Lila was born. He said it was necessary." His name was Doctor. Halverson Samuel froze. He set the bottle down slowly. "Halverson," he repeated, his voice low. "I've heard that name." He lost his license. Conducted unsanctioned trials under the guise of pediatric care. There were rumors, unproven but loud, that he tampered with sight-related treatments. His eyes lifted sharply. "David, if you've been giving this to your daughter all these years." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. David's face blanched, his broad shoulders sagging as though struck. "I trusted him," he whispered. "All this time." Clara placed a steady hand on his arm. "We didn't know, but now we do. That's what matters." Samuel leaned back, folding his scarred hands together. "If she is showing signs of sight now, it means the damage was not complete. The absence of the drops may be allowing recovery. But you need proof, medical records, prescriptions, anything that ties Halverson to this formula. Without it, the world will call it speculation." The next day, David began digging. He contacted the clinic in Denver, where Halverson had once worked. Officially, they had no record of his practice beyond a decade ago. But David, using his police connections, reached an old colleague in the state licensing board. After hours of tense conversation over the crackling phone line, he obtained a lead. A file marked with Halverson's name had been locked away after his suspension. Clara watched the toll it took on David. He looked older than his 42 years, his hazel eyes hollowed by regret. Yet beneath his grief flickered determination. Ranger followed him from room to room, as though sensing that his master was bracing for battle. Meanwhile, life in Cedar Falls buzzed with whispers. At the general store, Evelyn Grant muttered that the Monroes were hiding something. Caleb Moore dismissed it with a shrug, but Hannah Miller argued softly that perhaps hope had finally returned to the family. Thomas Kettering noticed Clara's quiet exhaustion when she came to buy flour and offered a kind word. "Whatever people say, you keep your head high." Clara thanked him, though her thoughts remained with Lila, who at home was learning to trace shapes on cards by touch and, astonishingly, by sight. That evening, David returned from the station with a thin envelope clutched in his hand. He spread its contents on the kitchen table, photocopies of faded reports, letters, and notations. One bore the signature, Dr. A. Halverson. The words chilled Clara as she read. The document spoke of sight inhibition trials, of compounds intended to restrict optic response for controlled testing. The realization sank like stone in her stomach. David's fists clenched. He did this to her. Intentionally, his voice was raw, broken. And I let it happen under my own roof. Clara reached across the table, her fingers firm on his hand. "You were misled. That is not guilt. It is betrayal. The blame is his, not yours." Ranger stirred at their feet, tail sweeping the floor as though affirming her words. Lila, in the next room, hummed softly to herself while arranging her blocks. The sound was fragile, but alive. In that moment, David knew their path had changed. It was no longer enough to guard hope. Within their walls, they had uncovered a name, a crime, a truth that demanded more than silence. The thaw of spring came quickly to Cedar Falls. Patches of green pushed through the earth, and the sound of rushing meltwater filled the air. But as the town brightened, a darker tension began to creep into the Monroe household. David and Clara now held proof that Dr. Halverson had experimented on children, that Lila's blindness had not been fate but design. It should have felt like victory, yet instead it cast a long shadow. Truths this sharp had enemies. It began with whispers that turned sharper than gossip. Evelyn Grant, ever watchful from her yellow porch, claimed she had seen David burning papers in the yard late at night. She spoke of it at the quilting circle in town, where women gathered weekly in the basement of St. Andrew's Church. Among them was Sarah Whitfield, a tall, lean woman of 45, with angular features and piercing blue eyes. Sarah was a teacher at the local elementary school, respected for her discipline and high standards. Life had hardened her after her husband's sudden death in a mill accident. She lived with 2 grown sons and held herself with stern pride. When Evelyn whispered that something unnatural was happening with the Monroe girl, Sarah's suspicion bloomed quickly. "Secrets," she said firmly to the others, "they never end well." Meanwhile, at the general store, Thomas Kettering overheard Caleb Moore and a group of farmers debating the same subject. Caleb, with his calloused hands resting on the counter, frowned. If the girl wasn't blind after all, why lie about it? Why keep it quiet? Another farmer muttered that perhaps David wanted sympathy, while Hannah Miller, the seamstress, defended the family gently. Or perhaps they were protecting her. You don't know what that child has been through. Still the murmurs spread, carried on the thawing air. One afternoon, Clara walked into town for supplies. She kept her auburn braid tucked under a scarf, but she could feel the eyes on her. Mrs. Evelyn Grant stopped her directly on Main Street, her sharp chin jutting forward. "We've been hearing strange things, Clara." The girl laughing, pointing, seeing things she shouldn't. "What exactly are you doing in that house?" Her voice was accusatory but coated in false concern. Clara met her gaze calmly. "I care for her, Evelyn." That's all she moved past, but Evelyn's glare followed her down the street like a cold wind. That evening, when Clara returned, David sat at the table with Sheriff Walter Briggs, who had come unannounced. Walter's heavy frame filled the chair, his weathered face lined with worry. "David," he said gravely, "there's talk spreading faster than snowmelt. Some folks think you're hiding something dangerous. Others whisper the name Halverson. Seems word of him is resurfacing. You need to be ready." David clenched his jaw. "I won't let them drag my daughter through rumors. She deserves truth, not gossip." Walter studied him, his steady blue eyes softening. "Truth has a way of rattling cages. Be sure you're ready for the fight." After Walter left, Clara laid the folder of Halverson's records on the table. "We can't keep this hidden," she said. "The longer we wait, the more twisted the story becomes in other mouths. We need to show them what was done." David rubbed his forehead, his hazel eyes heavy with conflict. For years he had lived by silence, shielding his daughter from the world's judgment. To throw open the doors now felt like stepping into fire. Yet when he looked toward the living room, where Lila sat tracing shapes in the lamplight, with Ranger curled beside her, he knew silence was no longer enough. The next morning brought another blow. An article appeared in the county paper, a small column buried on page 3, but enough to stir unrest. It spoke vaguely of questions surrounding medical treatment of a child in Cedar Falls, and named David as the father. Though it did not mention Halverson outright, the implication was clear. Someone had leaked whispers beyond the town's borders. Clara read the article at the kitchen table, her lips tightening. This wasn't just gossip. Someone wants to bury this truth before we can speak it. David slammed his fist against the table, the sound startling Ranger from his sleep. Then we won't let them. In the days that followed, they began preparing. Clara gathered the documents carefully, arranging them into order: prescriptions, reports, Samuel Keene's notes. David spoke with Samuel again, the older man agreeing reluctantly to testify if necessary. "I don't relish stirring old ghosts," Samuel admitted, adjusting his spectacles. "But if it saves that child, I'll stand beside you." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much betrayal in war to tolerate it at home. Still, the opposition grew. Sarah Whitfield, from her place at the school, warned parents that secrecy in households always led to danger, her stern voice carrying authority. Evelyn Grant pressed harder, whispering that Clara had brought strange change into the Monroe home. Even Caleb Moore, usually cautious, admitted to his neighbors that something isn't right. Yet, amid the rising tide, hope burned brighter within the Monroe house. Lila's eyes grew steadier each day. She reached for Ranger's collar, following its gleam. She traced letters Clara drew in chalk on a slate board. She laughed when David tapped a rhythm on the table, her storm-gray eyes shining with awareness. Each gesture reminded them why they fought. On one quiet evening, David stood at the window, watching the last snow melt into the earth. Clara stood beside him, Ranger lying at their feet. David's voice was low but resolute. "We can't keep her hidden anymore. If they want the truth, they'll have it. Halverson won't bury us in silence." Clara's hand brushed his arm, gently. "Then we go forward together." And in that vow, spoken against the backdrop of a thawing town, the Monroe family stepped into the storm of truth, knowing that the fight ahead would demand every ounce of courage they had left. The county courthouse in Denver stood tall and solemn, its stone columns streaked with decades of weather, its wide steps crowded that morning with reporters, townsfolk, and strangers curious about the case that had seeped out of Cedar Falls. David Monroe had not set foot in such a place since testifying years ago as a police officer, yet now he stood not as lawman, but as father. Beside him walked Clara Hayes, auburn hair tucked under a plain hat, her shoulders squared in quiet defiance. Between them, clutching Ranger's thick black and silver fur, was Lila. The child wore a pale blue dress, her storm-gray eyes lifted toward the light that spilled across the courthouse steps. For the first time in her life, she did not appear lost in a void but present, her small face glowing with awareness. Ranger trotted confidently, his amber eyes scanning the crowd. At 6 years old, his gait was powerful and purposeful, a sentinel guiding the girl he had always guarded. A murmur rippled through the onlookers as they saw Lila glance toward the sun, her hand reaching forward as though to greet it. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. At the bench sat Judge Mary Ann Keller, a woman in her early 60s with sharp cheekbones, steel-gray hair cut to her shoulders, and a gaze that brooked no nonsense. Known for her impartiality and fierce defense of children's rights, she had earned both respect and wariness across the state. Her black robe hung loosely on her lean frame, but her presence filled the chamber. Dr. Samuel Keene was first to testify. Adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, he spoke clearly of the compounds found in the drops. His voice carried the authority of decades spent in medicine. "These formulas," he said, lifting one of the bottles for the court to see, "were never approved for use. They are designed not to heal, but to inhibit optic function. In plain terms, they can restrict vision." Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor, a young man named Michael Abrams, clean-shaven with dark hair and quick, precise gestures, laid out the evidence with methodical care. He was known in Denver for his tenacity, a lawyer who had risen quickly by tackling corporate malpractice. His crisp voice echoed, "What we have here is not misfortune, but malpractice. A child was condemned to years of darkness, not by chance, but by deliberate design." On the other side, Halverson himself did not appear, his whereabouts unknown, but his former associates had sent a representative, an older attorney named Clarence Doyle. Doyle, with thinning white hair and a suit too fine for his stooped frame, attempted to argue that the prescriptions had been experimental but not malicious. Judge Keller's piercing gaze cut through his words more than once, forcing him to stumble. When David took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His broad shoulders seemed heavier than usual, his hazel eyes shadowed by years of guilt. He spoke not as a policeman, but as a father. "I trusted him," he said, voice low but steady. "I believed every word, every instruction, because I wanted to save my child. But those bottles stole years from her. I cannot undo them. I can only stand here now and demand the truth be seen." His words, heavy with emotion, left no one unmoved. Finally, Clara was called. She stood tall, her hands clasped before her, her amber-brown eyes shining with quiet strength. She told of the small signs she had noticed, the courage it took to stop the drops, the first time she heard Lila whisper, "Bright." Her voice trembled once when she spoke of her own lost daughter, but she steadied herself quickly. "I could not stand by and let another child live in silence." Lila deserved more. Judge Keller's verdict was clear. Halverson, though absent, would face criminal charges. The licensing board would move to revoke all related trials, and the state would open an inquiry into pharmaceutical oversight. More importantly, Keller turned her gaze toward David and Clara. "Your courage brought this to light. Your daughter will not walk in darkness any longer." Outside, the courthouse steps became a stage for reporters. Flashbulbs popped as Clara shielded Lila gently, while Ranger pressed close to her legs, tail sweeping the air protectively. David answered few questions, his deep voice repeating only one phrase: "We just want our daughter to have her life back." Back in Cedar Falls, the tide shifted. Evelyn Grant, who had once whispered suspicion, now stood awkwardly on her porch as the Monroes passed. She offered no words, only a nod. Sarah Whitfield, the stern schoolteacher, approached Clara days later at the market. Her piercing blue eyes softened for once. "I misjudged you," she admitted, voice clipped but sincere. "I hope you'll forgive my sharp tongue." Clara inclined her head politely, not gloating, simply acknowledging the change. The town, once rife with whispers, now gathered around with support. Hannah Miller sewed a bright quilt for Lila, patterned with suns and stars. Caleb Moore stopped by with fresh milk from his farm. Even Thomas Kettering carried extra treats for Ranger when Clara came to shop. Slowly, suspicion gave way to pride. Cedar Falls had become the place where a child's sight had been saved. Life within the Monroe house transformed. One room was cleared and filled with paints, paper, and colored chalk. Lila spent hours there, sketching shapes, tracing Ranger's sturdy silhouette, drawing the sunlight as she saw it. Her laughter, once a rarity, now filled the halls daily. David, though still marked by regret, began to stand straighter, his hazel eyes warmed by the joy of watching his daughter come alive. Clara, no longer merely a caretaker, had become something deeper, a pillar of the household, a second mother in everything but name. On a warm April afternoon, the family gathered on the porch. Lila leaned against Ranger, giggling as the German shepherd nudged her hand with his nose. David sat nearby, carving a small wooden figure, while Clara tended to flower boxes along the railing. The air smelled of thawing earth and new blossoms. "Daddy," Lila said suddenly, her voice bright. David looked up. She pointed toward the horizon where the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the mountains. "It's beautiful." David's breath caught. He dropped his carving knife, eyes filling with tears he made no attempt to hide. Clara's hand slipped into his, firm and warm. Ranger barked once, sharp and triumphant, as if declaring the moment sacred. And in that golden light, the Monroe family, once bound in silence and shadows, found healing. What had begun as whispers of despair ended with a child's laughter and a home filled with light. This story reminds us that even in the deepest shadows, God's light can break through in ways we never expect. What seemed impossible for years became possible through faith, perseverance, and love. In our daily lives, we may carry burdens or face trials that feel too heavy. But God works miracles quietly, often through the people and moments we least expect. Let this be a reminder that His hand is never far, and His blessings can turn sorrow into joy. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and your family always. And if you believe in the miracle of God's light, write Amen in the comments below.